He fired me with a smile, thinking he'd buried me for good. What he didn't know was that I had the blueprint and the receipts. Now I run the company his father begged me to save. You won't want to miss this story. But before we dive in, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a video like this one. My name is Nina DeVera, and I am 36 years old. I started at Wexler and Company with nothing but a refurbished laptop, a secondhand blazer 2 sizes too big, and a work ethic sharp enough to cut through the noise of every louder man in the room. 10 years ago, we operated out of a dingy, subleased floor with duct-taped chairs, chipped mugs, and shared logins that crashed if 2 people clicked at once. I was 26 and invisible to most, except when things broke, and no one else knew how to fix them. I didn't ask for titles or attention. I read contracts nobody else wanted to touch, stayed late to catch supply delays before they spiraled, and wrote the SOPs that turned chaos into function. By the time we moved into our new downtown headquarters with glass walls and catered meetings, I had risen to senior operations manager. On paper, it sounded impressive. In practice, it meant I carried everything from vendor negotiations to performance reports, without ever getting listed in press releases. I was the engine, and they liked that I ran quietly. Until Chase Wexler stepped out of the elevator like he had been dropped there by nepotism itself, in a royal blue suit and shoes that had never touched rain. The CEO's son, fresh off an accelerated business course in Europe and eager to bring in new energy. He grinned like a debutante politician and shook hands like he was kissing babies in a campaign ad. "So excited to learn from everyone here," he said, without irony, without asking a single question. During our first meeting, he talked over the agenda I'd built. He monologued about synergy and disruption, quoting jargon from outdated management books as if they were original thoughts. He had nothing of substance, but all the posture of someone who had been told his whole life that posture was enough. The next morning, a revised org chart dropped silently into our inboxes. No announcement, no acknowledgement, just a name, Chase Wexler, perched above mine like a crown on a map I had already drawn. He was now my supervisor, and suddenly, people who once came to me started looping him in. My timelines were revised without discussion. Strategy decks I authored showed up with his initials and digital signature. I watched it unfold without a word, the way a veteran watches a rookie swing wildly at the wind. The others laughed at his jokes, nodded at his recycled ideas, called him a fresh perspective. But I didn't flinch. I had seen this story before. Men like him were the thunder, loud and full of themselves, but women like me were the ground, steady and holding everything up. And while Chase soaked in applause, I took notes. Because charm doesn't build systems. And someday, someone would need to know who really did. It started with small things, the kind that don't set off alarms, but instead build quietly, like water pooling under a floorboard. At first, Chase would echo my instructions in meetings 5 minutes after I gave them, tweaking a word here, softening a directive there, so that by the end, it sounded like his idea entirely. Then he started sending out recap emails to the team after our weekly stand-ups. Emails I used to send recapping plans I had laid out, but signing them with his name at the bottom as if he had authored the entire strategy. I watched my phrasing appear in his memos, my workflows repackaged with flashier language and less precision. Once, he pulled a junior analyst into his office and told them my projections seemed a little cautious, even though those same numbers had saved us from a supply chain disaster the quarter before. He began scheduling meetings without me, then referencing my work as if I were a ghost whose ideas floated conveniently into his lap. The most infuriating part wasn't the blatant theft of credit, it was the way he delivered it with that same toothy grin like he was doing me a favor by amplifying my voice. Amplifying. That was his favorite word. He used it constantly, as if his presence alone was a megaphone instead of a filter. I once presented a 12-week rollout plan I had spent a month refining. The next morning, he rewrote the entire thing with colorful headers and empty buzzwords, then sent it directly to the executive team with a subject line that read, "Streamlined Vision," from Chase Wexler's desk. My name wasn't even in the footnotes. I didn't confront him, not yet. I just started keeping records. Every duplicate slide, every meeting where he contradicted me in front of staff with the air of someone correcting a waitress on how to pronounce Merlot. His changes weren't better, just louder. They created confusion, wasted time, and forced my team to backtrack constantly to clean up his revisions. But no one questioned him. Not out loud. He had that invisible armor some people inherit the benefit of the doubt, the presumption of genius, the automatic defense of power by proximity. I watched him carefully, noting how he would smile at interns, laugh too loudly at the CFO's jokes, and linger just long enough in the hallways to look indispensable. And while everyone else seemed to be falling under the spell of his last name, I was busy noticing something else entirely. For all his noise, he didn't actually know how to build anything. He was imitating momentum, borrowing authority, and the more he tried to erase me, the more precise I became. My spreadsheets grew teeth. My emails became layered with data he didn't even understand. Because if he wanted to wage a quiet war, I would respond in kind. Not with fury, with proof. They handed me the project like it was a gift, wrapped in false praise and urgent deadlines, tied together with Chase's voice, saying things like, "Only you can pull this off, and we need your magic touch." It wasn't mine to begin with. The logistics were already a mess when it landed on my desk. A Frankenstein's monster of half-baked ideas, last-minute vendor changes, and vague goals that shifted every time someone new looked at them. Still, I did what I always did, tightened the screws, laid down structure, made something out of the chaos. I stayed late, reworking the spreadsheets, called vendors to renegotiate timelines, rewrote briefs so the cross-functional teams wouldn't walk into meetings blind. It was salvageable until Chase got involved again, just a few days before launch, and rerouted key deliveries without telling me. Said he had a gut instinct, that our original plan was overcomplicated. His instinct caused a ripple effect that left 3 trucks sitting in the wrong warehouse, customer orders delayed, and an emergency meeting on Monday morning where suddenly all eyes were on me. I showed up with receipts, backup emails, timestamps, but Chase had already framed the story. His report was on the director's desk before I even walked through the door. A clean, glossy PDF with sections titled Breakdown and Oversight and Lack of Execution Ownership. My name was in bold under both. Not once did he mention the reroute, or the fact that he had been added to all communications but never responded. I sat in that meeting and listened to my work get dismantled by the very person who had sabotaged it. The worst part wasn't the blame. It was the casualness of it. The way he leaned back in his chair and flipped through his own presentation as if he were discovering my shortcomings in real time, like a disappointed professor reviewing a paper he already planned to fail. Afterward, I was called into HR and told my performance was being placed under review, a phrase that sounded like a trapdoor with no bottom. I didn't argue. I nodded, signed the acknowledgement form, and walked back to my desk with my heart pounding and my jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might crack. But inside, a different kind of quiet was growing. Not the silence of fear, the silence of a mind sharpening its edge. If they wanted to put me under review, then I would do the same. I would review every corner of that company, every pattern, every email thread Chase thought was deleted, every project timeline he altered behind my back. I had spent years building systems that held other people up. Now, I would build one that caught him falling, and when it was time, I wouldn't need to yell. I would simply show them everything they chose not to see. The room was colder than usual, though I knew it wasn't the thermostat. It was the way Chase sat across from me, hands folded like a schoolboy practicing manners, a sympathetic tilt to his head that didn't match the gleam in his eyes. He spoke in soft tones, the kind used by people rehearsing kindness, each word carefully chosen to disguise the blade behind it. "This isn't easy for any of us," he began, which was laughable considering the slight upward curl of his mouth said otherwise. "The company is moving in a new direction," he added, as if I hadn't helped draft that very strategy 2 months ago. Then came the phrase he'd probably practiced in the mirror. "We're restructuring, and, unfortunately, your role is being dissolved." He let the word dissolved hang in the air like steam off a fresh mug of poison. I didn't flinch. I didn't ask questions. I didn't give him the satisfaction of surprise. I just nodded once, stood up, and said, "Understood." That was it. No tears, no begging, no attempt to reason with a boy playing boss. I walked out of the office with my spine straight and my expression unreadable. the kind of calm that unsettles people who expect collapse. At my desk, I took my time. They had expected me to pack up a few framed photos, maybe a plant, some pens. They didn't expect the quiet efficiency with which I backed up my email archives, downloaded relevant files, copied internal notes, saved Slack messages, and secured every single piece of proof I had spent the last year gathering. I didn't need a badge to exit the building. I had my resignation disguised as termination, my silence disguised as surrender, and most importantly, I had truth disguised as data. As I rode the elevator down, I looked at my reflection in the mirrored walls. I didn't see someone who had been fired. I saw a woman finally cut loose from a place that had been draining her brilliance by the drip, a place that had tried to shrink her into silence while propping up a man with inherited power and zero substance. I walked through the lobby with one hand on the strap of my laptop bag and the other clutching a mental blueprint of everything I was about to build next. Chase thought he had won. Thought firing me would be the end of the conversation. But what he didn't know was that the moment he handed me that folder with the severance packet, he also handed me the one thing I had never been able to access while employed: total freedom. And with that, freedom came fire. Not the kind that burned wildly, the kind that smolders just beneath the surface, patient, calculating, and absolutely inevitable. I didn't cry after they fired me. I didn't rage or spiral or sit on the floor of my apartment asking why. Instead, I opened my laptop, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and reached out to the person who taught me what real leadership looks like. His name was Victor Lang. My first boss, back when I was 23 and so green I thought Q4 pivot was a dance move. Victor saw something in me back then and pulled me into war rooms I had no business sitting in, just so I could listen and learn. He used to say, "Watch the room, not just the speaker. Power is quiet." I remembered those words as I sat across from him over lunch 2 days after my firing, in a small corner bistro that hadn't changed since the recession. He asked what happened, and I told him everything, not out of bitterness but precision. I laid out how Chase wormed his way in, how the infrastructure I spent a decade building was now run by someone who had never opened a supply chain dashboard in his life. I told Victor how I walked out of that building with a hard drive full of data and a mind that was already sketching blueprints. He didn't laugh. He didn't offer sympathy either. He leaned back, folded his hands, and asked, "What would it take for you to start your own shop?" I blinked. Then I answered. The rest of the conversation was less like catching up and more like strategy chess. He asked the right questions. I had the right answers. By the time the check came, I had seed funding. Enough to rent a small office, hire one employee, and cover basic operating costs for 6 months. No strings, no board, just faith. Faith that if I could fix broken systems for companies that undervalued me, I could do it for clients who actually wanted results. I spent that night drawing workflows on my kitchen wall, mapping out what I wanted the consultancy to look like. Not a place full of jargon and pitch decks, but a quiet engine. The kind that taught rising leaders how to prevent the very dysfunction I had survived. The kind of firm that didn't just plug holes but built better boats. I called it Core Line, because that's what I'd always been. The quiet structure underneath the noise. While Chase was probably still fumbling his way through my old spreadsheets, I was designing a business model that made his entire approach obsolete. I didn't need revenge. I needed clarity, and for the first time in months, I had it. Because I wasn't trying to claw my way back into a company that had forgotten who I was. I was building something from scratch again. Only this time, I wasn't the engine behind someone else's vision. I was the architect of my own. And this time, I was taking up space on purpose. I didn't announce anything. No LinkedIn post, no passive-aggressive tweets, no grand declarations that I was back. I let the silence do the talking while the work spoke for me. The first client came from a cold email. A mid-sized logistics firm in Jersey City that had heard about a woman who could untangle knots faster than a switchboard operator in the 50s. I walked into their office with a laptop and a proposal, sat across from the CEO, and laid out exactly how to shave 10% off their supply chain costs without cutting a single employee. He didn't ask for my resume. He looked at my model, looked at me, and said, "Can you start Monday?" Within 3 weeks, The inefficiencies were gone. Their staff actually smiled in meetings again. Word traveled. One referral became 2, then 3. In under 6 months, I had quietly consulted for 3 direct competitors of Wexler and Company, the very place that thought my exit would be the end of me. I never mentioned the name. I never burned them in a deck or whispered their flaws in a boardroom. I just delivered results so clean they looked inevitable. Clients liked that I didn't showboat. They liked that I listened more than I spoke, that I didn't just talk strategy but rolled up my sleeves and rewired their systems like a surgeon who knew exactly where the bleeding was coming from. I hired 2 full-time staff by month 4, both women. One who had been passed over for promotion 3 times at her last firm, one who had taken a career break to raise her children and was told her moment had passed. I gave them space, not just opportunity. And the work we did together started to build a rhythm, the kind of deep operational tempo that's hard to explain but impossible to fake. Coreline wasn't flashy, no marble reception desk, no neon signs. Just a clean table, a whiteboard, and a set of minds that understood the heartbeat of a company better than the executives who usually ran it. Sometimes I'd pass the old Wexler building on my way to a client pitch. I'd look up at the glass panels, wonder if Chase was still strutting through meetings with my old slides, and feel nothing, not even a flicker. Because while he was clinging to the illusion of authority, I was building influence. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't need validation to feel real. I had become what I was always meant to be. Not someone else's backbone, but my own anchor. And as the client list grew and our impact deepened, I realized something simple but powerful. I didn't have to fight to be seen anymore. I just had to keep showing up and letting the work speak so loudly that even the people who once silenced me had no choice but to hear. It started as a trickle, like a faucet someone forgot to tighten. A client email gone unanswered. A supplier shipment delayed without explanation. A project timeline slipping a few days, then a few weeks. At first, I thought it was just the usual growing pains that come with any company adjusting to new leadership. But then the pattern sharpened, became clearer, like outlines darkening on tracing paper. One of my former junior coordinators, Asha, messaged me on LinkedIn under the guise of grabbing coffee. She didn't even try to play coy once we sat down. "It's chaos over there," she said, eyes wide, voice low. "Chase keeps changing processes without telling anyone. Clients are pulling out, and half the ops team is looking for new jobs." I nodded but said nothing. I already knew. I had started to hear the stories from multiple directions, whispers that floated through back channels, private Slack messages, and late-night texts from people who had once stood beside me in project war rooms. The contracts that had once been airtight were now fraying, delivery deadlines missed, budget forecasts off by double digits. Entire departments left confused about who approved what. The foundation I had spent years building, quiet layer after quiet layer, had begun to splinter under the weight of someone who didn't understand its architecture. Chase had replaced steady hands with flashy gestures. He liked making announcements more than he liked listening. He'd streamline a system only to realize later it served a purpose he never asked about. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so painfully predictable. And then came the resignations. First a project manager, then a senior analyst, then 2 people from HR. One by one, they started disappearing from the org chart like burned-out stars in a dying galaxy. Some landed at companies I had since consulted for. Some reached out just to vent. A few asked if I was hiring. I listened without gloating, not because I was noble, but because I didn't need to say a thing. The truth was doing the work for me, and deep down, they all knew what I knew. Chase wasn't built for this. He had the suit, the last name, the handshake smile. But he lacked the spine it took to hold a company together when the ground shook. He had inherited a kingdom and mistaken it for a stage. What he didn't realize was that the show could only go on for so long before the audience started noticing the cracks in the set. And while the spotlight still followed him, the room was slowly emptying out. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I just kept working, kept building, because while he tried to patch a sinking ship with buzzwords, I had already built something that floated. And the tide, as always, was shifting. It landed in my inbox on a Tuesday morning, disguised as a forwarded message from an old coworker who had always been more observant than loud. The subject line was innocent, almost laughably so. Thought you should see this. What followed was a redacted internal memo, the kind dressed up in corporate jargon and padded sentences, but I knew how to read between the lines. They were blaming me. Not directly, of course. That would have been too risky. But the language was slippery, a passive-aggressive masterpiece of executive distancing. Phrases like legacy operational frameworks and inherited inefficiencies traced a dotted outline of my work, like a chalk body on pavement. It didn't even make sense. The issues mentioned in the memo occurred months after I had left, long after my logins had been wiped and my name scrubbed from workflows. Yet there it was, a ghost version of me being dragged through the mud to cover Chase's inability to lead. I stared at the screen for a long time, not out of anger but calculation. This wasn't just about a bad decision or a fumbled quarter. It was the first real attempt to rewrite the story. And I wasn't going to let them hold the pen. I took a breath, saved the file, and stripped away the metadata like I had done 100 times before when cleaning up executive presentations. Then I attached it to a fresh email and sent it to someone I knew would care. She was a business journalist with a reputation for surgical precision and a no-nonsense style that made PR teams break into hives. I didn't sign my name. I didn't need to. The memo spoke for itself. 24 hours later, the article hit. The headline didn't name me, but it didn't have to. It questioned the ethics of legacy firms blaming departed staff for leadership failures. It asked how someone who had been praised for operational excellence for a decade had become the scapegoat for a decline that began after her exit. And tucked within the piece was a mention of Wexler and Company, quoted not from me, but from multiple sources with direct knowledge. I watched the reaction unfold in real time. Former colleagues shared the article with carefully worded captions. Industry leaders reposted it with raised eyebrow emojis. And in the background, I knew Chase was reading it too. Not just the article, but the message it carried. You cannot bury the person who built the foundation without drawing attention to the cracks. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I just returned to my work, because I had already learned the most powerful tool in dismantling power is not noise, it's evidence. And this time, they had handed it to me. All I had to do was let it speak. The headline was sharper than I expected. When nepotism fails, inside the brain drain at Wexler and Company. It was splashed across the front page of the business section, like a scar finally allowed to show. I didn't even need to open the article to know what it said, but I did anyway, each sentence unfurling like a ribbon I'd tied months ago without knowing where it would land. They never named me, not once. But I was everywhere in it. I was in the missing metrics, the departure logs, the sudden drop in production timelines, and vendor retention. I was the unnamed former operations lead who had quietly exited amidst restructuring, and whose absence, according to 3 different anonymous sources, left a vacuum no one seemed capable of filling. The article didn't just call out the cracks. It traced their roots back to Chase Wexler's appointment, his lack of experience, his recycled strategies that derailed tested systems, and the mass exodus of staff that followed his arrival. It painted a picture of a firm once praised for its seamless backend, and now drowning in backlog. There were charts, timelines, quotes from industry analysts, even a vendor who spoke about sudden confusion over logistics and delayed payments that cost them thousands. What struck me most was the tone. It wasn't sensational. It was clinical, precise, like watching a surgeon outline exactly how the infection spread. The journalist had done her homework. I knew because the phrases she used mirrored conversations I'd once had behind closed doors with my old team. She talked about frameworks being dismantled and replaced with vague innovation plans that lacked structure. She noted how departments were now siloed, how middle management had become bloated with redundancy, how meetings were full of slide decks but empty of decisions. Every word made it clear that someone had watched the unraveling from the inside. I thought I would feel triumphant seeing it printed, that maybe I'd smile or feel vindicated, but the truth was quieter than that. It felt like an overdue truth finally speaking in a room that had been too loud with pretense for too long. I didn't post about it. I didn't forward it to anyone. I just clipped the article, printed a copy, and slipped it into a folder with my original termination letter. Not because I needed the proof, but because one day, I might want to remember what it looked like when silence gave way to exposure. The funny thing was, people started calling again. People who had shrugged when I left, people who had nodded politely when Chase spoke in circles. They wanted to know if I was hiring, if I had room on my new team, and I did. For the ones who remembered who built the foundation. For the ones who had seen the headline and understood it for what it truly was, not an attack, but an audit. One that started the moment they fired the wrong woman. The email came on a Sunday morning, masked as casual but pulsing with desperation. Subject line, coffee? The sender, Alan Wexler, the CEO himself, a man who used to nod at me in elevators like I was part of the architecture. Now, after the expose and the quiet fallout that followed, he wanted to catch up, to get my insights on how we might stabilize things moving forward. I read it 3 times, each word sinking in like sugar in cold tea, slow and heavy. There was no mention of Chase, of course, no acknowledgement of what had been done, or undone, or detonated. Just a vague gesture toward collaboration, like I hadn't been thrown out the back door while the building still had scaffolding my hands had built. I sat with it for an hour, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted the response to taste like the lesson it was meant to deliver. I drafted a reply that was polite, professional, and lethal in its restraint. I thanked him for reaching out. I declined the coffee. And instead, I attached a consulting proposal with itemized tiers, timelines, and deliverables, each line backed by experience he had once deemed disposable. My hourly rate was 10 times my old salary. Not out of ego, but accuracy. If they wanted to fix the mess his son made, they'd need the woman who had built the systems his son unraveled. Within minutes, I saw the email was opened. 20 minutes later, it was opened again, this time by someone from the legal team. By Monday morning, I had a counteroffer. It was still beneath what I'd sent. I declined again, this time without a proposal. The third message came with no numbers, just a note asking if I'd reconsider. I didn't respond, not because I wanted revenge. I had already passed that exit. What I wanted was acknowledgement, and they were offering it the only way they knew how, by asking me back into a room they had once escorted me out of. Chase, I had heard, was no longer managing daily operations. He had been shifted to strategy development, which was corporate speak for sitting in a corner until the board figured out how to quietly phase him out. The irony didn't sting. It settled. Like dust finally landing on a shelf that had waited too long to be wiped clean. People talk about power like it is a performance, a thing you hold in your voice or your presence. But I've learned it lives in your absence too, in what happens when you refuse to return to the place that broke you unless it is entirely on your terms. I didn't need a seat at their table. I was already building one of my own, and the view from here was clearer, quieter, and finally mine. I agreed, but not in the way they hoped I would. I didn't come back with a lanyard or a staff badge or any soft landing euphemisms that let them save face. I came back with terms, not demands, terms. Boundaries drawn in ink, not pencil. If they wanted me to fix what Chase had unraveled, I needed control. Not partial, not negotiated, full. I would choose the internal audit team myself, no names from their shortlist. I would rewrite the training protocols from scratch, stripping out the jargon and installing systems that couldn't be sabotaged by ignorance and loafers. I would work independently, reporting only to the board liaison, not to any exec still afraid to admit that nepotism had a cost. And Chase Wexler, the golden boy who handed me my walking papers with a smile that barely masked his glee, would attend my sessions. Not as a contributor, not as a co-leader, as a silent observer. I wanted him in the room, in the second row, notebook open, mouth shut. Not because I needed to humiliate him, but because learning can only begin when performance ends. I sent my terms on a Wednesday morning. No fluff, no explanation. Just the contract, the timeline, and a note that said, "My integrity is not negotiable." I gave them 70, 2 hours to respond. They answered in 36. Agreed, every term. I walked back into the building through the front entrance, flanked by a new team I had handpicked. No one greeted me at the elevator. No one needed to. I wasn't back for camaraderie or nostalgia. I was there to do what I'd always done, quietly, strategically, thoroughly. In my first session, Chase was already seated. His suit looked tighter than it used to, his hair less practiced. He nodded at me, and I nodded back, and that was the entire exchange. I started the session by writing 2 words on the whiteboard: structural accountability. Then I turned around and said, "Let's begin." I didn't look at him again. I didn't need to. My presence was the correction. My curriculum was the closure. And every time I laid out a system he had once dismantled, every time I explained a process he had bypassed for flair, I watched understanding flicker in the faces of those who had followed him down. Not shame, not regret, recognition, the kind that comes when a lie dissolves in daylight. I wasn't there to be liked. I was there to be useful, and I was. Every hour logged, every session delivered, every policy restructured was another brick in the wall between what I had survived and what I would never allow again. And the irony? It tasted like clarity. Clean, cold, earned. Every session began the same way. I walked in with a black binder, a dry erase marker, and a quiet that stretched farther than any apology ever could. Chase was always already seated, 3rd chair from the left in the 2nd row, dressed like someone trying to remember who they used to be before the storm arrived. He never looked up, not once. His pen scratched paper like he was trying to dig himself out through ink. I never called on him, never acknowledged him by name, and never paused to see if he understood. That wasn't the point. This wasn't a classroom for redemption, it was reconstruction. Brick by brick, I taught what leadership actually looked like: how to manage failure without deflection, how to design systems that respected the people they served, how to course correct without scapegoats. I used examples pulled straight from the archives, case studies that mirrored his errors so closely you could see the color drain from his knuckles. He took notes, pages and pages of them. I caught glimpses of them once: bullets and underlines, arrows looping around phrases I had used years ago when building out the original playbook. I had a feeling this was the first time he'd actually read the manual. The staff watched him like a fallen statue, unsure whether to pity or applaud his silence. But that didn't matter either. My job wasn't to rehabilitate him. It was to repair the damage he had done, and maybe teach others how to prevent it from happening again. I noticed the shift not in him, but in them. In the way, department heads started asking sharper questions. In the way, timelines got leaner and meetings shorter. In how no one waited for Chase's nod before greenlighting a decision. My words had found their way back into the walls, this time with stronger mortar. Chase remained a shadow through it all, hunched over his notebook like a man trying to rewrite his own history in real time. But it was too late for that. The story had already been published in the minds of those he once dismissed. The difference now was that he was being made to sit with it, listen to it, and record every line in his own handwriting. There was a peculiar satisfaction in watching him learn without having the comfort of pretending he already knew. No smug smile, no interruptions, just silence and scribbles. One day, after a particularly loaded session on ethics and chain of command decisions, I noticed his pen slow to a stop. He stared at the final slide for longer than usual. Maybe something finally landed. Or maybe the weight of it all just finally caught up with him. Either way, I didn't wait to find out. I closed my binder, thanked the room, and walked out. My work was never about revenge. It was about restoration. And sometimes, the most powerful lesson a man like Chase Wexler can learn is what it feels like to be led by the woman he once tried to erase. The real power never came from corner offices or glass-walled boardrooms. It came from the staff meetings in cramped break rooms, from the sticky notes left on monitors with quiet solutions, from the assistants who kept things from falling apart while someone else took credit on a conference stage. So when I was handed the reins to lead the restructure, I didn't look up. I looked around. I started with people like Marisol, who had been scheduling executive calendars for 6 years with the precision of a military strategist. She became head of operations. Then Damien, the night shift IT lead who had once built a crash recovery system over a weekend when the servers melted down. I tapped him to oversee systems infrastructure. I didn't ask anyone for permission. I just laid out the proof, performance metrics, problem-solving records, peer reviews that had been buried in unread HR folders. I didn't play politics. I played memory. I remembered who had stayed late, who had stepped up, who had held the weight when Chase and his ilk floated above it all. My restructure wasn't about leveling the playing field. It was about acknowledging who had already been playing on expert mode with no extra lives. I set up listening sessions where junior staff could offer input directly. No filtering, no risk. I created feedback loops that bypassed the traditional approval hierarchy, because sometimes the best idea in the room is 3 cubicles down from the one with the title. I watched eyes light up when people realized they were finally being asked instead of told. There was no ribbon-cutting ceremony, no viral LinkedIn post announcing the change. Just better systems, clearer communication, and a palpable shift in energy that settled over the office like fresh air after a storm. People stood taller, they spoke more freely. Even the break room felt different, like the silence that used to hang between microwave beeps had been replaced with a low hum of possibility. I didn't need thanks. The results were thanks enough. Watching Marisol run a strategy session with C-suite composure, seeing Damien get stopped in the hall to explain an update someone used to pretend they understood, hearing the laughter in meetings where once there was only tension, I was never there to shine. I was there to build a place where others didn't have to dim to survive. And that meant making sure that no one ever had to wonder if they were allowed to lead, only whether they were ready. Because real leadership doesn't hoard power, it multiplies it. And if you do it right, the applause comes not in claps, but in systems that run smoothly long after you've left the room. On my final day, I walked into the building not as an employee, not even as an outsider returning, but as the architect of something rebuilt from the ashes of arrogance and oversight. The place looked the same on the surface, the same polished floors, the same buzz of fluorescent lighting, the same wide windows offering a view of a skyline that had once made me feel so small. But the air had changed. You could feel it in the rhythm of footsteps, in the way conversations carried without hesitation. People greeted me differently now, not with forced smiles or performative respect, but with quiet nods that meant something deeper. I carried the final report under my arm, neatly bound, thick with strategies, processes, and names of those who should have always been leading. At the top of the title page, Foundations of Operational Integrity. Underneath, centered like the spine of the entire document, I placed a quote. One sentence from the onboarding notes I wrote in my first year at Wexler and Company, the notes Chase once copied and presented as his own. Consistency is not glamorous, but it is the framework of excellence. I remember writing that in the glow of an overworked monitor, back when I still drank cheap coffee and stayed late because I believed in the bones of the place. I never thought those words would circle back as a quiet reckoning. I walked it over to the executive floor myself. No assistant, no ceremony. Just me, a stack of accountability, and a signature line waiting at the bottom. The CEO met me with a hesitant smile, a fragile attempt at friendliness resting beneath eyes that had learned the hard way what happens when you confuse nepotism for succession. He gestured toward the conference table where Chase once sat smugly across from me. That seat was empty now. I placed the report down, uncapped the pen, and signed my name. No flourish, no hesitation. Just the full weight of 10 years of work condensed into ink and intention. I stood for a moment longer, not because I needed validation, but because I wanted to remember this silence. Not awkward, not expectant, just still. A silence earned. I nodded to the CEO, turned, and walked out without looking back. Not because I was trying to make a statement, but because I had already made one. Every page of that report, every policy revised, every assistant promoted, every broken system mended without bitterness or applause, it all spoke louder than any farewell email could. And as I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing like bookends on a chapter no longer mine, I felt nothing but clarity. I hadn't just rewritten the rules. I had written proof that leadership is not a gift handed down. It is a discipline carved through action. And my signature was not just a name. It was a boundary, a blueprint, and a beginning. I passed the building on a Tuesday morning, the kind with sky the color of fresh paper and air that didn't cling too tightly. The same revolving door still spun like a slow carousel, letting out interns with coffee orders and middle managers with Bluetooth earpieces stitched into their ears like permanent accessories. I used to walk through those glass doors with my shoulders squared and my voice quiet, hoping to be noticed for the work, not the volume. Now, I watched from the sidewalk, hands in my coat pockets, not out of nostalgia, but out of acknowledgement. This was where I had been reduced, overlooked, erased in polite tones and sanitized feedback. But this was also where I learned the value of my silence, the discipline of restraint, and the exact moment when strategy matters more than outrage. I didn't come out of it bruised. I came out blueprinting a future. When people talk about revenge, they think of flames and spectacle, scorched earth and triumphant declarations. But for me, the real victory wasn't in headlines or resignations. It was in restoration. Not just of my name, but of a system that had been too comfortable discarding women like me once our usefulness was consumed. The consulting firm I built now had a waiting list, not because we promised miracles, but because we delivered systems that functioned with integrity. I had watched assistants become department heads, quiet thinkers take the stage, and leaders born not out of title but out of trust. And none of that came from getting even. It came from getting clear, from knowing exactly where I belonged and never asking for permission to stand there again. As I turned away from the building, I saw my reflection in the glass, older, steadier, with eyes that no longer sought approval, only alignment. Power, I realized, isn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the most feared presence at the table. It is about being undeniable, about knowing you are the infrastructure, the logic, the scaffolding they forgot was holding everything together. And when they try to replace you with noise and charm, you let the system they built on borrowed brilliance collapse under its own weight. Then you build something better, not just for you. For the ones coming after, the ones still drinking burnt coffee and staying late, hoping someone notices. I see them now, I hire them, I mentor them. I remind them that being underestimated is not a curse. It is a position of observation, of precision. And when they ask how I survived it, how I turned a closed door firing into an empire with a foundation deeper than revenge, I tell them the truth. I didn't just rise, I reclaimed. Then I built a ladder out of every discarded rung. That is the real win. Not the fall of what failed me, but the rise of what will never forget me.